Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm just going to walk you through an economic scorecard for Canada for the third quarter. So this is basically the period ending September 30th. So this presentation is only going to be one perspective, economic policies. I'm only going to cover the major areas. There's other things will drive an economy, but I'm going to be quite more like a high-level view to tell you what's going on with the trends. So I'll talk about GDP growth. I'll talk about manufacturing sales, employment, wages, housing prices, retail sales, the key areas of an economy that drives what's going on. So if we look at GDP growth and we take a look at Canada, Canada's on pace to only have a growth of about 1.2% this year. Now that being said, we've seen considerable downgrades since the start of the year because of different factors, and we had the fires in Fort McMurray. We've seen global pressure that China's economy is not growing that strong, and even the U.S. has seen a little bit more sluggish growth this year. And since Canada drives a lot of their economic growth from both retail sales and exports, it's only a matter of time where you see these impacts come into play. Now I wanted you to show you manufacturing sales because we still have a solid manufacturing part of our economy here. But the key aspect here, the things that are driving manufacturing in Canada are both three sectors: food processing, forestry, and transportation. Transportation, if you really think of it quickly in a succinct way, is basically automotive production, which is basically predominantly in Ontario. That's been driven by consumer demand. Now, that being said, when you start driving consumer demand and high prices like housing and automotive, you're driving up household debt, and that's something to bear in mind when you look at these trends. Wages have seen some growth, but the growth has been sporadic across industries. We're still on pace to see significant growth in wages this year. Despite a growing economy, we're actually growing a little bit better than GDP growth this year. We're still only keeping relatively up with inflation when you look at the overall period to period, year to date averages in terms of what you see. So we're seeing significant challenges in terms of wages. But you're also going to see a lot of things come into play. Government's still under restraint in terms of what it's looking at as compensation, other than any sort of arbitration settlement. You're also seeing pressures from businesses like manufacturing to have to absorb additional costs. Well, they don't necessarily absorb them, but they're under pressure with global conditions to keep price competitive, so wages are going to be under pressure. So you're going to see a lot of pressure points coming into that. Housing prices. We're on pace again for about 8 to 10% growth in housing prices, which again, if you look at the two factors from wage growth, you look at GDP and inflation, we're still 3 to 4 times and sometimes 5 times the pace of what those areas are. Now, if you look in a nutshell, housing prices are not sustainable. So at some point, we're going to have some sort of market correction, or you're going to see something where rules will change. And the federal government's already imposing certain rules to dampen down housing, but there is a problem overall, because when you start dealing with real estate, it's not just federal policy, it's not just provincial, it's municipal policies as well as what's going on with the private sector. So any sort of policy going around real estate has to involve all parties, and I'm not sure that's happening right now in terms of policy development, because what you can have happen quickly in that area is government can put a quick fix into that, but you're only looking at the symptoms, not the root cause, so you're not really fixing anything. Now let's talk about retail sales. They've been sluggish since February, and if we go into this quarter now, they're still relatively sluggish. What the federal government had hoped is the stimulus package that they introduced, including cuts to the middle class, as well as changes to the family tax benefits, would have impacted retail sales. Well, up to through August, we're not seeing that impact have a direct implication on growing the retail sales. So what's happening that by the numbers, we're seeing people are saving money or paying down their debt, and some of that has to do with provincial policies that you're seeing in play, like hydro rates, carbon taxation that you see out in BC. So the household budgets are under pressure. So if they're under pressure, they're not going to spend money, and that's something to bear in mind. And that's something these numbers are kind of showing. And it's retail sales that drive a lot of the economies. It's about 2/3 of the GDP growth is driven by retail sales. So if you put pressure on the household budgets, that's going to impact the bottom line. In summary, Canada's in for a few challenges over the next few years. We still are seeing sluggish worldwide growth of only about 3.1%. We've also seen sluggish employment gain where the market's becoming more temporary with part-time workers. That is significant because if you look at quotes and that in terms of business, part-time workers don't earn as much as full-time workers. There's no benefits. And that's something that you need to bear in mind because that puts pressure on household budgets. Housing prices appear to be starting maybe on a decline. Now that's hard to say what that decline will be because it's going to be based on who enters the market and how the economy grows. But there is going to be pressure on housing prices as we move forward over the next 3 to 5 years. Exports in general about 520 billion, but there's a pressure on the world right now to kind of look at protectionism policies when you have sluggish economic growth, which can impact Canada because 1/4 of our GDP is exports, and we depend on exports because of the size of our country. Government approval processes have improved a little bit, but not significantly enough to attract or to get projects off the ground. We've seen a couple pipelines in play, one out west that we saw basically be approved. But the rest of what you're seeing on the economic activity has been slow and sluggish in terms of approving projects. If you're going to get things off the ground and support foreign direct investment, then you have to make sure these processes aren't hung up for long periods of time. Now, you do need to be fair and transparent with that process to make sure that you look at all angles, but you need to close down some of these debates to make sure they're not getting silly in terms of what's happening to move progress forward, right? Or being hijacked is more probably appropriate words. The infrastructure funding, despite what the federal government said they would push out, it's been slow to get out the door, and that's impacting. Now, the overall stimulus itself will have a marginal impact on the economy. It's not going to drive growth up to 3 to 4% because it's not designed to do. The government can't stimulate every other aspect. Plus, there's other factors that influence economic policies from retail spending to exports that drive a lot more of the development on GDP. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind, when you introduce more tax policies or things, they don't typically add to growth. What they do is they hinder growth. And the Liberal government decided that they want to impose carbon tax or price for carbon. Any jurisdiction that imposes more taxes is seen actually more sluggish or slow growth. So how these policies develop will be something to watch in the economic trends in the months and years ahead to see whether or not the impact's actually done what it is. And it's something that I'll be measuring as we move forward. This presentation is kind of designed to get you a quick overview of what's going on in the economic conditions in the country. It also allows you to ask key questions of the Liberal mandate. When they came in, their overall goal was to improve the lives of the middle class. You need to ask yourself what you're seeing with the development policies and the overall economic conditions. What pressures your family budget's going to be under over the next few months and the next years ahead as you start seeing these policies start coming into play. Thank you.